Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ich freue mich, mein Name ist Marc Beutner, bin Mitglied hier am Department und freue mich, diesen Staffelstab in Form eines Mikrofons übernehmen zu können, um jetzt einmal ins Englische zu wechseln. So let's switch to English. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to introduce Mr. Stephen Billett from Griffith University, Brisbane in Australia, here as our second speaker for the keynote today. And Stephen Billett is professor for adult and vocational education in Australia, and he's also working as a chief editor in Australia for Vocationals and Learning, which is a journal which he will introduce tomorrow in our session about the young researcher program here in Paderborn. And I'm very proud to say that we can get some information from him about his main topics, and his research topics are focusing on learning and work, on vocational education and training, and also about historical, cultural, situational, and individual contributions towards work. And in these fields, he's also working on the development of vocational education and authenticity of work and authenticity of learning in work situations at the workplace. And so I'm very proud to present Stephen Billett with his keynote about 2 words, an account of learning through practice, traditions, practice, and potentials. It's your stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Three things to start with. Firstly, thank you very much for your kind invitation for me to come here. Secondly, I won't apologize for speaking in English, because if I was to speak in German, I would be apologizing all of the time. Okay. And I have produced a full paper which talks to this presentation, and that is available either from myself or from Dagmar Festner. Please send email messages and we will send you a copy of the paper if it's of interest to you. The third point is that you will see what I'm exploring in this talk. And one thing I'm interested to do is to engage with German colleagues who can help me understand the German perspectives of the issues that I'll be referring to. What I want to argue, and in contrast, I think, to the previous talk, is a focus on learning through practice. And I want to make a case, and the case goes something like this, that given the importance in building human capacities and in advancing societal goals, there is a need now for to develop a comprehensive account, a science almost, of learning through practice that addresses contemporary and emerging workplace requirements. And this account necessitates identifying and understanding factors that shape this learning on its own terms, not on the terms of what happens in educational institutions, the discourses of schooling, and the discourses of schooled societies. And I think such an account has the capacity to inform how, for instance, students are prepared for life in business and commerce. How I'd like to progress is firstly referring to some key premises, then talking about learning through practice, and then make some comparisons of particular tradition. I'll be referring to one tradition of learning and cultural practices, and then beginning to conceptualize learning through practice, and then beginning to provide an account of what a consideration of learning through practice might look like. And there'll be the notions of practice curriculum, practice pedagogies, and epistemological practices. And then I'll conclude. A key premise is that when we engage in any activity, work activity, two types of changes also occur. Firstly, we learn because we do something which either generates new learning or reinforces and improves what we know. But there's also, when we engage in practice, we're remaking culture. We're actually taking forward our occupational practices at a particular point in time as we address particular problems in specific situations. And in doing so, we remake cultural practices. And when we engage in new tasks, we're involved in the process of transforming culture. And I think a comprehensive account of how this occurs is now required. And as I say, this goes beyond drawing upon the discourses of schooling and the premises of school societies. And because I think there's clear limits to what is advised by those discourses and those accounts. But equally, not all forms of knowledge are best learnt through practice. So we need to understand the strengths and the limitations of learning through practice. Importantly, this is not an anti-schooling, an anti-educational discourse. It's simply trying to find space, acceptance, legitimacy for learning through practice in an era which is dominated by the discourse of schooling. So, learning through practice. It's been the most common and sustained mode of learning occupations across human history. It is central to humanity and human progress. We would not be here today if people had not continually learned through practice across human history. Humans have lived in settled communities for 10,000 years, large cities for 5,000 years. And if this is a crude scale here, by the way, if you can imagine that this is 10,000 years, it has only been in this period of time where we've had the institutionalized provision of vocational education and occupational education. Do we believe for 1 minute that humanity has managed to just drag itself across this period of time to reach the Fachhochschulen? I don't think so. Do we believe also that it is only now, in this time and in this era, where there are forms of knowledge which need to be learnt, which can only be learnt in the college, the Universität, the Fachhochschulen? I don't think so. So, it would seem that in looking across history, similar processes of learning have occurred in Europe, Asia, and likely elsewhere. And that family and local workplaces were the common site of that learning in Europe, in India, Japan, and China. As Griffith advises us, this process of learning which had lasted and been supported in Europe for a millennium, 1,000 years, was largely destroyed by industrialisation. And as you begin to look at this process of this learning, it appears that the majority of it was learnt through the process called mimesis, which is observation, imitation, and then practice. And indeed, if you look across the literature, as I've been doing recently, it is difficult to find instances of where a process of teaching occurred. The process was about learning, as I hope to expand here. Early accounts of this from ancient Mesopotamia. The Talmud, the Jewish book of law, says, "As it is your duty to teach your son the law, teach him a trade." The tradition was for the son to go to the rabbi's school in the morning and in the afternoon learn his father's trade. Plato referred to the learning of craft. The son learned his trade by growing up in his father's family and participating in the family activities, imitating what he saw his father doing. At first, the imitation would be playful and childish. carried out with such toys as a child could handle. Later, it would become more deliberately purposive, more intentional. Practice produced technical proficiency in details, and the growing boy would act first as his father's helper, then as his associate, and would eventually himself become head of the family and the centre from which further training in the family craft would radiate. Similarly, in ancient India, archaeologists have found small artifacts, pottery artifacts, at sites where pottery was made, and these were made by children, learning to make the kind of artifacts that their parents were making. The important point here is that these accounts provide us with the bases and evidence of a curriculum and pedagogic strategies. Why did the boy go to the yeshiva in the morning and work with his father in the afternoon? Perhaps the first recorded statement about the theory-practice divide. I don't know. Clearly, Plato's account of learning in Greece provides us with a good account of a curriculum, but also, that is, the course to follow, the path to go along, but also the use of those pedagogic strategies of engaging in toy-like activities and small versions of what the father was working on. The literature from Greece also indicates that personal epistemologies were very important in this learning process. For instance, Plato, in talking about the preparation of doctors, said the best physicians are those who have treated the greatest number of constitutions, good and bad. From youth up, they have combined with the knowledge of their art the greatest experience of disease. It is better for them not to be of robust health themselves, for they have to have all manner of diseases in their own persons. For it is not with the body, but with the mind that they cure the body. And thus they infer further bodily diseases of others from the knowledge of what is taken within their own bodies. So there the importance of a personal way of knowing and how its centrality to effective occupational practice. But let's take an example which is of a different kind, and perhaps one that you may not be familiar with. Imperial China is the greatest continuous culture across human history. But in looking at the kind of work that's been done, particularly in Imperial China, you see the traditions of work are quite distinct from those in Europe. Let's take a stock somewhere. In 1085, as an ex-Englishman I learned at school that in 1085 the Doomsday Book estimated the population of Britain was between 1.75 and 2 million people. Norway had about 80,000 people at that time. There aren't many countries that existed we can make comparisons today. However, at that time, China's population was estimated to be between 110 and 118 million. People lived in, it was a highly organized society. People lived in cities that had populations of over 70,000. Those cities had running water, sewage systems, street lighting. They were advanced cities and places to be. And this particular next figure I always find interesting. The census in AD 2 suggested that the Chinese population was 57,671,400 people. So, an advanced society that could even suggest such a number of people. In 1085, the Song dynasty's mint was producing over 6 billion coins a year. Can you imagine that? These are the kinds of coins that were produced. The coins were made through 3 processes. That's one of them there. And the coins were designed so that the metal came in at one point and left at another point. The square in the middle was part of the production process. So these coins were actually part of an industrial process. And by 11 1114, they were printing paper money because the demands of making all of these coins was too much. And in fact, after they began printing money in 1114, they were able to close down 50 copper mines. So the requirement for mass production arose far earlier in China than elsewhere. Forget Henry Ford. This occurred a long time earlier. And with respect, forget Gutenberg. Printing took place an awful lot earlier here as well. In dealing with a large population, a process of modular approach to work occurred. And this was used in the development of building components, tiles, and even the process of writing. And Lothar Lederosen, a German, obviously, he's written about this. And he has written this book which indicates the modular structure that was used to mass produce things. And it's a bit like looking at an IKEA catalogue, except it was a long time ago. But much before then, in the Shang dynasty, Shang was famous for making these large copper urns. The Zhou dynasty here, this is a die for making knife blades. And in the Qin dynasty, this is a trigger mechanism that was used for crossbows that had 3 working components and could be adapted to work on different kinds of crossbows. As I've said, they already produced huge numbers of coins, drainage pipes, arrowheads, roof tiles, etc. The Tang dynasty was famous for its very high level of craft. So between the Shang and the Qin, there was a movement from craft to industrial production. Perhaps most famously, the terracotta warriors. Many of you would know about those. The ones that have been uncovered so far demonstrate a very high level of consistency in the clay, the lim, and which reflects a high level of work organization. Each of the warriors is different. They're unique. And the significant differences across the cohort. Yet, it seems that only 8 molds were used to make these warriors. The molds were used very creatively by people who were used to engaging in this kind of craft. And on each warrior, there was a quality control process which indicated who had made it and which village it came from. So the labor organization was very strict, and there was a clear method of production. The Jinden kilns, this was the place where they made this white porcelain, which is so famous because it's a source of the white clay. They produced some vast numbers of high-quality artifacts, which all had to be exactly the same. The order for the Imperial Palace in 1577 comprised of 96,500 small pieces, 56,000 large ones, and 21,000 items for sacrificial ceremonies. A French missionary who visited this place reported watching a cup passing through more than a dozen hands, one worker giving it an initial shaping on the wheel in a matter of seconds, another sitting on its base, another pressing it into a mold to make sure it was uniform, another polishing it with a chisel, etc., etc. And as many as 70 people might be involved in the production of a single item. Later, the division of labor that made these artifacts was described as follows. If the painted decoration on each piece is not exactly alike, the set will be spoiled. For this reason, the man who sketched the line will learn sketching, but not painting. Those who painted study only painting, no sketching. By this means, the hands acquire the skills in their own speciality, and their minds not distracted. In order to secure a certain uniformity in the work, the sketchers and the painters, although kept distinct, occupy the same house. And it was these items which were exported across the world, and as you know, it was these colours that were copied in Holland in Delft and are used in Europe. So yes, so this was an export industry. Yet, are these processes so different than what occurs today in the production of high-quality cars and aeroplane, for instance, where you have people engaged in very specific skills of a very high order of knowledge and capacity? I think it's important we say that because there's a concern, as I'll go on to suggest, that we will see this work as being more of production work. I'll come to that point. So there seems to be a distinct valley of skilled work. Skills like calligraphy were required in China by administrators, and this was part of the examination process to get into the public service. And one of the qualities of the length of the Chinese empire was that entry into the public service was based on merit, on public examinations. There's a very nice quote. It's a parable, and it compares the valuing of knowledge that comes through from practice, to go back to the doing, compared with the knowing about, the declarative knowledge. And this is a parable where a wheelwright, a person who makes wheels, a Stellmacher, is that correct? Stellmacher? Is talking to a powerful general, and making a distinction between what can be learnt from books and what can be learnt from doing. I see things in my own terms of my own work. When I chisel at a wheel, if I go slow, the chisel slides and does not stay put. If I hurry, it jams and doesn't move properly. When it is neither too slow or too fast, I can feel it in my hand and respond to it in my heart. My mouth cannot describe it in words, but there is something there. I cannot teach it to my son, and my son cannot learn it from me. So I have gone on for 70 years, growing old, chiseling wheels. The men of old died in possession of what they could not transmit, so it follows that what you are reading are their dregs. I think the word is Boydenschatz, is it? Okay. I think this provides a very early example of a questioning of the power of declarative knowledge, the very knowledge which is prized within education institutions, the written word, the word that can be spoken, against other forms of knowledge and knowing. And as I was saying, I think there's a difference in conception of the Chinese craft worker than the European craft worker, simply because of the size of the population and the need to address their needs. And it would seem to me that the Chinese artisan was less of an independent artisan, I beg your pardon, and more of an artisan having specific skills and capacities and working within a team. Yet, although there's these differences in the European tradition and the tradition from China, it seems that very similar processes of learning were occurring in these very different cultures. So, what were these processes of learning? There's actually very little written in China about this process of skill development, and there are enormous numbers of records from Imperial China. But it was said to me that this was not of interest to those who could write. One possibility was the use of rhymes and mnemonics, which could be passed on from one person to another. But perhaps most strongly it would seem that the knowledge that was learnt arose through the process of observation and imitation, mimesis, and very occasionally direct teaching or guidance from a more expert worker or master. And before the era of schooling, institutionalized provisions of occupations was limited to just a few occupations: medicine, law, military, and philosophy. But even then, for instance, in Hellenic Greece, practice was very important. And it would seem that the two very important artifacts for education, the anatomy class, but perhaps most importantly, the textbook, arose because of a lack of opportunities to practice. These were responses because medical students were not able to gain the extent of practice that was required. Hence, anatomy classes had to be developed so students could see inside the body, and textbooks were established to codify medical knowledge which previously had been passed on between doctors and their apprentices or their students. And this reminds me of a situation we have in Australia today where we have difficulty finding placements in hospitals for medical students because the demand is too great. Yet, I think the discourse of, in thinking about this, the discourse of schooling and school societies may not always be helpful. I use the word curse here, and that's a joke. That's humorous, by the way. Because I go to China, and I go to a city, and the city is called the place of 4 good fortunes, or I have a meal that's called, the 10 great treasures. So I was just extending this style to this here. But school societies have orthodoxies and assumptions about the inherent value and privileged status of schooling, which is fine. But it tends to ignore or deny the worth of learning in experiences outside of school settings. And education and schooling have brought many benefits, yet its discourses offer narrow accounts of human knowing, which often are restricted to that which can be observed. Learning, that can be measured, and I guess that's, again, coming back to the first presentation this morning, reflecting those. And also the kinds of knowledge that can be declared. And such accounts, I guess, are increasingly emphasized in standards and educational provisions, which I know you enjoy here in Europe. And the wheelwright might describe them as Bodensatz. Not captured or articulated in the educational discourse are many of the capacities that we require to do work. And the embodied learning that we know that comes through our sensory systems. So, for instance, when a midwife is listening to the heartbeat of a fetus through a Doppler scope, she listens. She will make a diagnosis, and most of them are women, make a diagnosis on what she has heard. And then she walks over and fills out the declarative form. She's made judgments on what she's heard, which is not a declarative form, and then goes on to capture it as a declarative form. The declarative form there is the Bodensatz. The lorry drivers that one of my PhD students works with, very modern lorry, computerized. The drivers still need to drive with the window down so they can hear the engine, because that's part of their knowing. Airline pilots, the planes that people fly in now, the jets we fly in, they have no direct physical control between the control and the flaps. And what they've had to introduce is haptic technology, so the pilots can actually feel the strain they're putting on the ailerons of the aeroplane. These are important aspects of flying a plane. And then, of course, what is so important in many occupations are the dispositions and the values which shape the particular occupation. Also, educational discourses tend to emphasize didactic teaching, and I think de-emphasizes learning. Bridget Jordan said, quite a time ago, the verbal material of ballads and tribal histories was not taught didactically, and nursery rhymes today, such lore was acquired and perpetuated through pattern imitation in situations in which the telling naturally occurred. Whatever the origins of the didactic mode, it has always been a minor mode of knowledge acquisition in our evolutionary history. In the West, however, the didactic mode of teaching and learning has come to prevail in our schools to such an extent that it is often taken for granted as the most natural, the most efficacious and efficient way of going about teaching and learning. This view is held despite the many instances in our own culture of learning through observation and imitation. So this process of mimesis, again Jordan, apprenticeship learning is based on imitation and behavioral matching. It is ancient for the human species and is rooted in our evolutionary history. Learning through observation imitation rather than following genetically programmed action sequence is important in all higher social animals. But it is humans who have developed this propensity in the primary modality of the acquisition of skills. So, mimesis, I think, is much maligned. Geschmäht, is that the word? Yeah. And is often seen as being simple processes, mere copying, mimicking. And what we know is that it's far from it. There are higher forms of imitation which require judgments to be made, comparisons to be made, actions to be undertaken. In fact, it seems to be a fundamental process of human cognition. And by the way, not only human cognition. Any animal that has to move to eat something else engages in observing, looking at patterns, trying to anticipate where the thing that it's trying to eat is what it's going to do or where it's going to go. So, for instance, in the state that I live in Queensland, Australia, a long way from where I live, I might add, crocodiles will sit on the side of a riverbank and watch. They will watch the dogs come past and work out what time the dogs come past. They also watch to see what time the children come out of school. So they look, find, and try and position themselves to have a meal. And Ikebani suggests now, with understandings from advanced cognitive psychology and neuro versions of that, that there's a multimodal and complex process that occurs when we make sense of things, and those processes are fundamental cognitive process, as I was saying. Observations are very important for understanding goal states, and they're also important in generating powerful cognitive representations which we use to engage in activity. Okay, but how does all of this help us understand how the requirements of contemporary work can be met through learning through practice? What I'm proposing and working on now is that an account of learning through practice has three key elements. Firstly, curriculum practices, a set of experiences which are organized. Pedagogic practices, which are ways in which those experiences can be augmented for particular reasons. And perhaps most importantly, the epistemological practices, the basis by which individuals engage. And I now want to just move through those. Studies from anthropology suggest that in looking at how people learn outside of school situations, that there is a form of learning which occurs through simply participating in that culture. So Bunn's work on nomadic people in Kyrgyzstan suggests that lots of the skills, riding a horse, catching animals, skinning animals, making milk, etc., just arise through everyday activity. But there's also some activities which require deliberate structuring of experience. One is learning how to make yurts, the houses that they live in. Another is being a blacksmith. Another is being an eagle trainer, because you have to catch a chick and grow up with the chick. And then there's the traditional storyteller, which requires a particular curriculum to engage with and learn. And going back to anthropology, we see that there's a practice curriculum, which Jean Lave recognized earlier from her studies of tailoring in Angola, in which the apprentice moves through from activities of activities which, if a mistake is made, there is low accountability, through to activities which, if a mistake is made, the error cost is high. So, for instance, in my own work of looking at how hairdressers learned, I could identify a practice curriculum that takes hairdressers through from, firstly, greeting clients, washing clients' hair, and then washing chemicals out of the hair, putting curlers in the hair. And the inevitable practice is that hairdressers first learn to cut men's hair first before they're allowed to cut women's hair. because there's a greater risk of messing up women's hair than men's hair. And then they go on to do more complicated tasks. But I saw recently a very simple but effective curriculum in this hotel here. This is the Marina Sands Hotel in Singapore. 1,300 rooms. One problem they have in Singapore is that they can't get Singaporeans to do work in like room attendance because they don't want to do that work. So they bring people in from outside, from China, Malaya, the Philippines. And this is a room attendant here. And the way the room attendants are prepared in this hotel is that, first of all, they learn how to organize the room in what is called a checked-out room. That is, the guests have gone. So they don't have to worry about guests. They clean those rooms. They learn how to do the pillows, which I now know how to do. You know those pillows I know how to do that now. I could get a job. And then they learn to clean the bathrooms properly and set things out. And once they've done that to a level of proficiency and a speed, then they're moved into working in rooms that they might encounter guests. By that time, they've proceduralized, learned all of those skills. So a simple sort of process. There's also there's other traditions, such as Singleton identified that pottery apprentices stay back after production and work on the pottery wheel and clay after production has been completed. So there's actually traditions of organizing of those experiences. And one that I've working on with midwifery students in Australia is as follows. And that is, midwifery students in Australia have two types of practice experience. One is called a follow-through experience, where they follow through birthing women through the prenatal process and up to the birth. And they have to do 20 of them to become registered as a midwife. And they also do clinical experiences as well. And in thinking about what can be learnt through those two experiences, for instance, the follow-through process helps them understand the birthing process from the perspective of the birthing woman, that provides great opportunities to learn goal states and the requirements to be an effective midwife, perhaps before they go on to engage in clinical experiences. So what I've suggested here is that perhaps follow-throughs come first and then gradually moving into clinical placements. That's a suggestion about how we might utilize two different kinds of practice-based provisions. In terms of pedagogic practices, from the anthropological literature in particular, and others, sociocultural literature, these are a listing of some of the kind of pedagogic practices which come through. Storytelling, verbalizing things, pedagogically rich activities, guided learning, which you'll be familiar with, etc. And the one I want to just briefly talk about is pedagogically rich activities, and that some practice-based experiences are inherently rich learning experiences. And the one I am going to refer to here is nurses' handovers, and that is when one shift of nurses who are about to complete hand over the care of the patients to the shift of nurses who have just come in. And they go through 5 elements. Firstly, they discuss the patient, what the person is, how old they are, is there anybody at home, should they be discharged? Then they talk about the patient's condition, or conditions, inevitably. Also, a consideration of the treatment, or treatments they're having. Then they discuss how the patient is responding to the treatment. And then they predict what is going to happen. Where will this patient go with this treatment? So as I'm sure you can appreciate, this is a potentially rich learning situation where causal situations, potential effects, and projections of those effects can be engaged with by students. It's also an activity which students can engage in at different levels of competence. So a student who's just learning some basic concepts associated with nursing can engage in that conversation and have those concepts contextualized. whereas a more experienced student nurse can engage in the discussion and engage and understand the causal links between treatments and responses. And then the graduate year nurses engage in the discussions about the prognosis. So a rich experience that can be engaged with in different levels by learners at different levels of competence. In my own work earlier, I've done these, you'll be familiar with this kind of stuff, of developing specific forms of knowledge, procedural knowledge, conceptual knowledge, strategic knowledge. So these kind of strategies are often used and can be used to enrich learning experiences. But that's boring. I've done that a long time ago. But what comes through from this literature is the importance of personal epistemologies. That is, the ways in which the learners engage and make sense of things. And that, as I've said, that most of the learning that you identify in looking at the literature comes through the actions of the learners themselves. It's the basis of their engagement and knowing which is so important. And it is more than epistemological beliefs. It's not just beliefs, it's those ways of knowing and engaging and understanding through sensory processes. It's also about how the person views themselves, their subjectivity, their gaze, the way they look at the world, and also the way they believe the world is looking at them, which shapes their forming identity as an occupational practitioner. And also the agency and intentionality of our students or learners in engaging those activities, which is so central to the quality of their learning, and the importance of the epistemological acts of how they observe, how they engage in mimesis, how they make the most, for instance, of the handover situation, and knowing how to act. So, from the literature, some of these personal epistemological practices can be identified. I've already referred to mimesis. Ontogenetic ritualization is an interesting one because it actually comes from studies of great apes. And it's how the young ape negotiates with mother to get access to the breast. And it reminds me, though, of the way that people negotiate access to learning opportunities in the workplace. When we look at the traditions of apprenticeship, what we find is that those traditions are not about the Meister teaching the apprentice. Quite the opposite. It's about the apprentice positioning themselves to learn through observation and imitation. And that even the word apprenticeship comes from the concept of apprehending, to take the knowledge. It is the apprentice's job to learn, not somebody else to teach. Trevor Marchand's work refers to the apprentices having to steal the knowledge, take the knowledge, because nobody's providing that knowledge for them. And as Mischler refers to, it's important that the learner assents to wanting to be a potter, a nurse, a doctor, because that is the basis of how they will engage and exercise their intentionality and their agency. And also the importance of learner readiness, the moment at which the learner person puts their hand up and says, I want to do that. And from studies of communities in Japan where they make specific kinds of pottery, and the only people that can be apprenticed are people from that community, just being the son or daughter of a potter is not sufficient. The young person has to stand up and say, I want to learn this. The same with the studies from Kyrgyzstan in the yurt making. Growing up in a yurt making family is not sufficient. The young person has to put their hand up and say, I want to learn that. And we know stuff about deliberate practice, which, you would know about that. So in sum, I think there's a need for a science of learning through practice, and I think this goes beyond what educational science and the discourse of school society suggests and informs us. And I think we need to draw upon a far broader range of explanatory bases. And I think likely dimensions of curriculum, pedagogy, and personal epistemologies seem to be likely. But I would say that, wouldn't I, because I'm coming up with that. And it would seem that we need to account for particular cultural and societal and situational factors. But just to finish, what I have here is something called cotton. You're all familiar with cotton? When cotton first came to Europe in the medieval time, it came with the knowledge that it didn't come from an animal, because people looked at it and said, it's from an animal. It came from a plant. So people in Europe tried to work out what the plant would look like. This is called the vegetable lamb of Tartary. The point is that these people lived in a view where fibre like that came from a sheep, and they could not conceive of it coming from a plant. And I think because we all live in a school society and are immersed in a school society and engage in a school discourse, that we don't appreciate and don't understand and automatically deny the importance of learning through practice and thinking about it in terms other than what occurs within educational institutions. So what I've tried to do today is provide an invitation to you in different ways to think about learning through practice, perhaps in a slightly different way, and try and think about learning through practice outside of the precepts, understandings, and practice, and even to some extent the lexicon that we have, because we are all very much embedded in the educational discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Und? Wunderbar. Thank you, Stephen, for your nice talk. Are there any questions from the auditorium? Comments, hints? No one at the moment? Okay, then it's up to me to look at my watch, and we have just only 5 minutes up to the end of this first scenario, and I'm happy to provide a little gift to you.
But seriously, folks, one of the things I've had difficulty with actually, because I'm only an English speaker, you know, nicht Deutsch, that if any of you are aware of traditions from the German-speaking world in which there is models of curriculum, you know, practice organization, pedagogic strategies, I would be very pleased to hear about them, because you have this long tradition of the Meister, which is very much a teaching role. But everywhere else I look, I see very little evidence of teaching occurring in this literature. The amazing thing is that I've only come across 2 instances of where direct interaction occurs between the master and the apprentice, and it's in exactly the same form. It is when the master lays hands on the apprentice to help them feel something which can't be gathered in words, what the Stellermarker was saying. And apart from that, I can't find any instances of where there is what we would call didactic processes or teaching processes. It seemed largely to come through practice and very occasional interaction. So I'd really welcome interaction with colleagues from the German-speaking world to help me understand that tradition here. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That's for you. Thank you for your nice talk. That's great.
Thank you very much.